welcome to Technically Speaking, the podcast where scientists and engineers come together to chat about common interests, share knowledge and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Laura, and in this episode I'm joined by pretty much the entire team. There's quite a lot of us, and we're here to talk about what's so difficult about communicating science. So to get to know everyone a bit and understand their motivation for being here, we're going to do this first segment as a bit of a rapid fire round. So each of us can sum up from our experiences of science communication or why we're passionate about this particular skill in just a few sentences, and possibly not stumble over your words as much as I am. So no pressure to the team, but Rwayda, let's start with you.
Science communication is a difficult thing to make, basically. So from my own experience as a lecturer, it's depend on your audience. If you're talking to a first year undergrad, it would be different if you're talking to fourth year undergrad. And it's all about like having like the connection within the class, and you'll have like within the same cohort, you'll have different sort of students. You'll have very bright student, not as bright students. So you always try to stay in the middle with your like trying to keep everyone in and get the conversation going in teachings.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know from my own experience of attempting to teach that pace is quite important and you can never get it exactly right. Ghalia, what about you? What's your experience?
I think mine is a little different to Rwayda, actually, because she's talking to people who kind of all are interested in the same kind of area, whilst from my experience, so I concentrate on looking at water resource planning and water resource management. And so it requires a lot of people to come together, technical and non-technical. And as soon as you say something like science or technical, it sends fear waves everywhere. Everyone starts shivering, like, no, I'm not technical, or I won't understand anything, or something like that. And I think historically, we've not been very good at communicating technical work to non-technical people, and hence there's this fear. And because of this, I think that now we kind of shy away from discussing some of the more meatier parts of science and the technical parts, and we end up looking at things a bit too binary, a bit too black and white, like the science as good or bad, and there's less of a conversation, I feel, because of this.
I like your comment about meaty science. I feel like there's a joke in there somewhere.
I'm sure someone will find that joke throughout this podcast.
I just thought it was funny, meaty science.
We can move on.
Amina, what about you? What would you like to share about your experience or passion about science communication?
I'm from a nuclear background. I'm a nuclear safety engineer, and I'm quite passionate about STEM events and sort of communicating with the wider public, whatever age that may be, whether that's industry or whether that's university students or whether that's just secondary students who are just interested in what to do. And I find that there's this big sort of fear factor around nuclear specifically, that it's very complicated, it's very scary, the consequences are dire, it's there's a whole thing around it. And then when you get things like Chernobyl, the show, or those kind of things which are coming out, I suppose they just don't really help. But actually I find that once you start talking to people, they're quite open to it. They're quite receptive to it. I feel like because we're talking about science communication, we just don't communicate it well. I know that things have changed recently over time, and people are making a huge amount of effort to sort of get the knowledge out there so that people aren't afraid of this. But I think there's a lot of work still to be done about it. Once you start talking to people, my experience has been, I know that Ghalia said that people are sort of like, oh, science, nope, don't know anything, I'm going to turn away. But I actually find, perhaps because it's such a sort of fear factor, or maybe it's just a different audience, I don't really know how it goes, but I found that once you start talking to people, they're actually quite open about it, and they actually ask really intelligent questions. So you can tell that they're following what you're talking about. They're not just sort of like doing filler questions just to sort of, I don't know, be nice to me or something. So yeah, I feel quite passionate about getting out there, explaining things, and just basically increasing people's knowledge that it's not this big, huge, thing that we all need to be scared of.
Yeah, and I think that's partly why we're all here, to increase people's knowledge and our own knowledge. Yeah, and I agree. It's kind of like that fear of the unknown, isn't it? Because nuclear technology, you don't often get to see it, do you? So if you don't know what it is, it's quite natural to like be slightly wary of it, I think. Ellie, what about your experience and your passion for this subject?
So I'm a zoologist, and I've also got a master's in wildlife documentary production. So I think my experience of SciComm is more how can you marry sort of science facts and information and processes with telling an entertaining story and presenting that to a general public. And we're sort of very lucky that we can film animals and it's all beautiful. And, you know, if you watch a David Attenborough documentary, you know, people are sucked in by a whale leaping out of the ocean. But how do we marry that with this is actually very serious, or there's a problem, or we want someone to do something? Like a lot of documentaries nowadays, fortunately, are a call to action or a call to arms. So we're using the science and we're using the picture and the story to influence people's lives, whether we want them to change what they eat or what they buy or what they wear. And I think it's so important to do that in a responsible way and in a nuanced way that sort of takes account of the wider population and, you know, the world as a whole, but also the specific audience that you're targeting at the time as well.
Yeah, that the ability to tell stories, whether it's with video of animals or data and graphs, if you prefer that sort of thing. It's less fluffy, but more interesting than some of it. Yeah, it's a really difficult skill, but it has a lot of meaning, doesn't it? I think some of the things that are stuck in my mind a lot have been because there's been a story behind it and I can see how it relates to my life and what I'm doing. So yeah, very good points. Antonia, your turn.
So from my perspective, I've kind of worked with in research, looking at really big top level picture of what would happen to the UK if you know we did go renewables. And once you've kind of done that analysis, what do you do with it? You kind of, it's supposed to inform people or talk to businesses, say, you know, looking at your energy trends, you know, maybe you want to, if you want to reduce your carbon footprint, this is how you do it. But then, you know, you're talking to people who are like financially motivated. So how do you sort of bring the technical part in without sort of making them fearful, making them worry about finances, and sort of communicate the need to do it without making them feel forced? You know, it's a lot of like almost like trying to market the positive impact to them so that they can market themselves in a positive way, but also actually do something positive for the planet. So my science communication kind of is a bit more policy making experience, you know, to decision makers and getting them like telling a story, but with graphs and data and making sure it's not too dumbed down. Like, you know, sometimes people just want a quick answer, like Ghalia says, you know, just black and white, tell me, do I go for it or not? And trying to give them the crunchy bits, but without being too wiped over, to blanket, yes, this is good, and no, this is bad, that kind of thing. So yeah, difficult balance.
Crunchy and meaty. We have to develop some sort of food analogy as we go through this. What's crunchy and meaty? Bacon.
Crisp sandwich.
What kind of crisps are you eating?
Meaty flavour crisps with fluffy sandwiches.
Yeah.
Aneeqa, you're the last person I can pick on as a victim here. What's your take on this?
I think very similar to everyone else. So I'm from a fusion background, and I've often been asked in different roles where I've been in before to communicate stuff about fusion. And sometimes that's like for making videos and with journalists and media and stuff. So like one of my old places, I'm not going to name any names, but they'd have like a media day where people would come to try and find out about the project and the work that's going on. And there's a huge difference in what different media outlets want from people as well, which I found quite interesting. So I remember once I was getting interviewed and they ask you questions, but they also just tell you what to say in response to the questions, the people are asking you them. And I remember this instance, they were like, so, you know, I've heard pineapple's amount of hydrogen is equivalent to like 10,000 tons of coal or something like that. And I was just like, I have no idea if that's true. And it's like, well, can you just say that then? Or, you know, something like along these lines. And I was just like, I don't know. But yeah, so I think I did end up saying it in the end because it was cleared by the comms people. But afterwards, in hindsight, I was like, why did I say that? I don't know if that's true. I don't know where they've got this data from. And they like, as people like, okay, again, food related metaphors, but they come up with these like analogies, metaphors, which I understand the useful nature of them in terms of putting things in context, which I think is necessary for people who aren't experts. But sometimes it does come at like oversimplifying a quite nuanced and complicated issue, which I think can be problematic. And also it's quite lazy journalism in a way, in that they rely on the comms departments of scientific projects or research groups and things like that, which, yeah, it's great for those researchers and that's the you know, the message that they want to get out there. But I think as a scientific journalist, for example, it should be your job to really investigate everything about what you're you know, looking at, rather than kind of having a preconceived idea and trying to just show that to people. I don't know if that made sense, but again, yeah, it all comes down to like creative storytelling, I guess, in a way, and whether that comes at the expense of the technical nuance and detail that might be important to the scientists.
It's hard to get that balance, isn't it, to make it relatable for people like the pineapple, and trying to sort of not dumb it down too much as well, and getting it technical. Because I often use a nuclear reactor, I often describe it as a giant kettle. And that actually works brilliant for people to understand how it's essentially just heating up. You get the steam and then you're using the steam to turn the turbines and et cetera, et cetera. But then if you dumb it down too much, then it's almost as if you're not doing it justice to what you're talking about. So it's about finding a right balance, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think as scientists, we're not really trained or not very good really at communicating what we're doing. And that's why other people come up with these kind of stories, because I guess it's more attractive to the general audience and things like that. But I think a lot of scientists do struggle or don't have the skills to communicate their research effectively or well, because let's face it, not a lot of people listen to scientists, do they? That's we're not as exciting as actors or footballers or, you know, any of those other professions.
I think you're doing yourself a disservice there.
Speak for yourself, Aneeqa.
So it was clearly very interesting. I think you're one of those people, Aneeqa.
Oh, thank you very much. We all are.
Yeah, I mean, I did a bit of training throughout my career on science communication. I think one of the things that I was sort of told was it's not necessarily about dumbing it down, but it's about maybe simplifying the story or talking to an intelligent non-expert and having that conversation with them, and like maybe thinking about a way to try and get those nuances across that I think a few people have touched on. I think from my own perspective, like going way back to when I was in school, like I found science pretty easy, like, especially when there was a teacher that explained something in a way that had meaning to me. So for example, the classical mechanics that you do in physics, I could instantly see how that helped me make sense of the world, because it was looking at how you would throw projectiles across a particular distance, or how you would figure out like the rolling resistance of tires on various different surfaces and gradients. So I found that really meaningful. But contrast that with my PhD, where I was mostly either confused or frustrated by all this nuanced information that wasn't necessarily communicated all that well to someone that was trying to get into that field. It honestly felt like that sort of nuanced detail was just for the privileged few. And it seemed to me that there has to be a better way of doing science and of communicating it, because I think you're right, a lot of scientists don't really take the time to sit down and understand how they could communicate their particular field, because they're so used to talking to people that already understand it. So I mean, for me, that's why I got involved in this podcast, which I'm actually really enjoying being part of. So now we've set the scene by talking about our experience of science communication and why we care about it. I think we should dig a little deeper and talk about some science topics that we think are difficult to communicate to a non-expert. So Ghalia, I think you've got quite some interesting things to say from your particular fields.
I guess I'm going to keep with the food and beverage theme then. So one particular area that comes to mind is that of bottled water. And there's an idea that bottled water is safer to drink than tap water. And so before I go into the kind of the comms around that, I just want to clarify that in the UK, tap water is definitely safe to drink, okay? We have a whole regulatory body called the Drinking Water Inspectorate, and their whole purpose is to monitor and ensure that the quality of water meets the EU Drinking Water Directive, so it's highly regulated. Contrast that to bottled water. They don't actually have the same type of regulations. So no one actually monitors the water at the source, or if they do, there's no independent regulatory body ensuring that does happen, or the production of water bottles, or how long it takes for the water bottles to get to us, or the conditions of those trip, how much sunlight did those bottles experience, etc. What's frustrating is that we have great comms when it comes to bottled water. We have great marketing campaigns that, guaranteed to quench your thirst, or there's like some runner running in slow motion to like the end of the finish line and grabbing said water bottle and is the happiest person alive. But then the water companies and the water industry, they're not very good at communicating that drinking water, the tap water, is actually good quality water. And it's really difficult to tell someone like, hey, I know you've seen loads of millions of adverts about how great these water bottles are, but water companies actually have a regulation in place to make sure that we have this good quality of water. Because regulation doesn't sound that exciting to talk about, right? It doesn't sound like, oh yeah, but actually, if you look at the regulatory body and what their report says, it's not that exciting. And I think we as in like the water like UK industry haven't done enough communication in terms of talking to the public about water quality. We only really engage when there's like extreme events like floods or droughts, or can you don't use your hose pipe this summer because we're experiencing drought. We're not very good at explaining actually this is our natural resource, and this is what we do to make sure that you have good quality of water, and if you have any problems or fears or concerns, this is how you can get in contact with us. And sometimes that's the case. Sometimes people are just worried and that's why they use bottled water. Sometimes it's a taste thing which can be solved. So there are lots of different ways in which we can sort it out, but we're not being that proactive. But the water bottled industry are. I guess the only way in which this conversation is kind of happening at the moment is looking at the bottle itself. So plastic being a problem, and the fact that it takes liters and liters of water just to make one bottle of water, or possibly even other ethical issues. So there are some water companies that are quite notorious for depleting particular water sources across the world. And that's kind of where the engagement happens, but not really in terms of the quality of water. It's more of a sustainability or an ethical discussion. And like kind of the quality of water kind of is put to the side often. So I find that quite a hard one to communicate.
Yeah, I didn't know that the drinks industry isn't as highly regulated as the water that comes out of our taps. And I mean, to be honest, I find it mad that we flush the toilet and like water the garden with perfectly safe drinking water.
Yeah, it's a bit strange, isn't it? Well, the thing is, you can water your garden with garden bugs, so that collects all your water, all the rainwater, and then you can use that. So there you go. That's another water saving technique there.
I have to say, Ghalia, like I feel really guilty because I'm sat here with like a water bottle that I got today. But in my defense, I went for a walk with my daughter and she got really thirsty and I didn't take water from the house. So then I bought a water bottle. So that's my justification for this water bottle.
I also, like, that's the thing, it's not binary, right? There's benefits to water bottles. There's the convenience that like when you're out and about, you can get it. It's definitely not like a monster thing, but it's just when the discussions develop into terms of quality. So people generally drink water bottles drink water from the water bottles because it's perceived as better quality. And that's where it's difficult to then communicate in terms of the quality. I'll forgive you this time, Amina.
I also think there's like a conspiracy when they banned water bottles, like from flights or from going through the airport, like you had to get rid of your water like every time you're going through security. And then you just had to buy like a really expensive bottle of water.
It's a personal mission of mine to take an empty non-plastic water bottle through every airport and find a tap and fill it up. Like there's like Reddit threads of like, oh, the water bottle in Bristol Airport is behind Boots, or the water tap in like Gatwick is here.
Do they always have a tap in every airport?
I don't think always, but also if you go to like Costa or something and say, can you fill this up for me? Often they'll do it for you if it's just water.
Pre-COVID, it was much easier to ask people to like give you a water bottle, but a lot of airports do have those taps.
Yeah, like water fountains.
And if you can't find them, ask someone because they usually do exist.
Or Reddit it.
Great points. Antonia, I feel like you mentioned marketing in your why you care about this. So is there anything around like the sustainability of how different drinks are manufactured that's worth pointing out that sort of feeds into this idea of like science communication that could be improved?
Yeah, so I've got an interesting workshop that I did on the carbon footprint of food and drinks. And, we gave the public 4 drinks to order in best of worst carbon footprint. And it was interesting because, there were kids involved as well as adults. And, ranging from if we have tea, coffee, orange juice, Coca-Cola, where would you rank those? And it was quite interesting, from the point of like some kids didn't know how orange juice was made, and the carbon footprint takes into account, where did you get the raw materials, how did you make the drink, how do you package it, transport it, use it, is there anything in the use phase such as preparing coffee, you boil hot water before you make the coffee, and then afterwards what happens to all the waste. So this was a really interesting exercise, and I wonder, what do our panel think on tea, coffee, orange juice and Coca-Cola?
Coke has always sounded like an enemy, right? So your natural thing is to be like, yeah, Coke. But actually what you're talking about is like kind of the raw ingredients and how you make it, and then the kind of the disposal of the waste. So for me, it might be tea or coffee. I'll put orange.
Yeah, it's got to be a plant one. It's got to be worse. The amount of water that goes into growing oranges and all that sort of thing, that's got to be huge. And also, we don't grow any oranges in the UK that I know of. So then immediately go flying, stuff it, and that's going to add a huge amount. So yeah, maybe oranges or maybe tea.
I'd say tea. I'm going to go with tea.
I'll go with tea as well.
I would say a milky coffee, because you've got milk from the cows, and I know milks are very like intensive, and yeah, I think coffee is going to come from ages away, and those barista machines look very energy intensive. I don't know what goes into them, but it looks like a lot of work to like grind the coffee and then steam it or whatever they do.
I'll be honest, it has been a few years since I did the workshop, so I remember the high level result. Okay, so here it is. Tea and coffee are on the opposite ends. Which end is on which though?
And well, just so that I can win, I hope tea has got a higher carbon footprint.
I'm still going coffee.
Yeah, I think it's got to be coffee. It's got to be the highest, because tea, the plants keep growing, right? So then you have to wait as long to like harvest the coffee beans themselves.
Oh, but considering like the whole process and stuff, and to roast the coffee beans and stuff, that's actually quite a lot of work. Whereas the tea is just dried in the sun. So I'm going to say coffee.
Oh, that's true. You know what? I have to switch coffee.
Great life cycle thinking, great thinking through the process of how it was made. Love that shows. So coffee, I think it was like 4 kilograms per litre of coffee.
4 kilos of CO2.
Yes. I'll have to verify this, but or other people can verify it and give me a shout,
Where Coke goes in this then?
Coke is in the middle. It is better than orange juice. I'm assuming freshly squeezed orange juice as opposed to concentrate or squash. I think that was about 3.5 or something. Whereas I think tea, it was like 10 times smaller than coffee is what I remembered.
Wow. It's quite a big difference. We wanted to kick that coffee habit then and switch to drinking tea.
So yeah, it was a really interesting exercise communicating this to people, because it made them think about where did their food come from in the first place and how to actually consider the environmental impact. Because, there was this big communication piece about considering where your food comes from in terms of distance. But then, if you just looked at like, if I got locally grown tomatoes versus tomatoes, say, from Spain or Brazil, that was actually a higher impact, because the UK isn't natively the good environment for growing tomatoes. So it was really interesting to see how this like communication piece from like 1990s became so prevalent that even like now, 3 decades later, people are still thinking of the air miles.
Wow, it sounds like it takes quite a long time for that sort of message to filter down. So yeah, some really interesting points there about how drinks are more widely different products. Just we don't really think about the full life cycle of where they come from and what their impact is. Ellie, I get the impression that your story about some science topics that might be difficult to communicate to a non-expert might be quite different with your background in zoology and documentaries.
Yeah, absolutely. With documentaries, wildlife in particular, we have to be very careful. I think we're always afraid of sort of breaking the rules of sort of broadcasting, and showing the one wrong thing or misleading the audience is something that we're always sort of very wary about in wildlife, especially because often you're following an animal and, you know, given the way the natural world is, or, you know, we don't interfere is a big thing first. But if you're following a prey species and you're trying to show people the life cycle, there's no guarantee that that specific animal is going to be alive to show all the behaviors that you want to show. So we have to be very careful in that either if we name that animal, all the shots are then of that specific individual, or that we are showing the life cycle in as true a fashion as we possibly can, and we're not misleading the audience into thinking, oh my gosh, you know, that animal had, you know, 3 spots on its left ear, and now this animal's only got 2. What the heck are these people doing? You know, and that's sort of a very big problem that is, you know, persistent in the industry. But also, like, we have guidelines. So yeah, you're not allowed to say, oh, this is little Timmy, and then 3 seconds later show an animal that's clearly not little Timmy, or even not clearly little Timmy. You know, there's always the eagle-eyed viewer that's going to write in and be like, I was watching that documentary and they showed this animal, and then 3 minutes later it was clearly a different animal. So there's always people sort of trying to not catch you out, but, you know, we have to be careful and we have to not cross those boundaries. But also we want to show a true picture. We want to show what the animals are doing. We want to show their behavior because we want people to know what it's like in the natural world, and we want them to know the beauty of it and the like majesty and the, you know, the amazement, and feel that in as true a way as they can. So yeah, it's very difficult, but it's very rewarding as well, I think.
Yeah, I had no idea that so much thought went into putting a documentary together and making sure you've got all the right footage, which was really challenging because animals don't necessarily perform for the camera, do they? They're just out there doing their own thing.
Yeah, exactly. In Secret Life of the Zoo, that is primarily really an entertainment show. You know, it's factual entertainment, but it's still, we're trying to entertain an audience. We want them to watch it and we want them to enjoy it. You know, you've got to get that message across. And yeah, if you need a shot of an animal walking left to right, you could spend 3 days trying to film that, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the animal is going to do that. So yeah, there's a lot of patience. Yeah, it's much harder than with an actor, and you can say, please, can you walk from that door to that door, and you can do it 10 times, but you might only have one shot at getting the animal doing what you want them to do.
Ellie, I guess part of what you're saying is, so you want to guarantee the trust of the audience. And I feel like trust is quite an important part, actually, that we've not really touched on. I think, you know, you want the audience to trust you so that you're telling a truthful story now, and you will do in the future. I think that's quite an important theme to pick out on, actually.
Yeah, so I guess you have to make sure that you're giving a truthful representation and making sure that what you show matches up with the story that you saw when you were recording it. And it sounds like storytelling is quite common to a lot of the things that we're talking about. And how do you tell a story that gets across that nuances? Aneeqa, does that fit with your perspective on things that are difficult to communicate about science?
Storytelling is the main issue in any kind of communication. And I think what stories we tell has a huge impact, because we choose what stories we tell and what kind of sticks in the public imagination. So like what Antonia was saying before about this study 30 years ago about air miles and things like that, that was communicated well. And that's the story that has stuck in the public imagination. And it's kind of like now very topical, very depressing, but with like COVID, the media has been going nuts for these blood clots recently with the COVID vaccine. And that's really in the public imagination. And I've had so many people asking me, oh, Aneeqa, do you think the vaccine's okay? Like, what about all these blood clots? And I'm like, okay, yeah, there's a risk of blood clots, but you're more likely to get a blood clot from COVID. Or what about all this other medication that you might be taking? What are the side effects of that? We have risks in everything that we do and everything we consume, but we still choose to do it. We all eat certain foods that probably aren't the best for us, or drink certain drinks that probably aren't the best for us. And who knows how many years of our life they're taking off if you wanted to like measure it in that way, but we still do it. We make that, you know, informed decision, and we do it. So it's quite sad in a way that the media sensationalizes stuff that, okay, yeah, we should be aware of what risks are and we need to make informed decisions, but focusing only on risks and not on the huge amounts of benefits that are expected from these things, I think is really sad. And I don't know what we can do to change that and to change public perceptions. But yeah, I think it's really important.
Aneeqa's just touching on risk. I just want to just point out that there's a massive risk that Dr. Aneeqa is also giving out medical advice. So
yeah, I mean, I'm not a medically qualified. People think I am, but I'm not. So yeah, thanks for that.
Disclaimer and caveat that.
I think the vaccine thing is the same, isn't it? It's all trust. I believe personally that getting the vaccine is a good thing for me. You know, it will help with COVID, it will help the population. But when you see things in the media sensationalized and all big risk of blood clot, is so very difficult to separate that from, you know, will this affect me? Should I be worried about this? What's the reality? Who do I trust now to tell me the truth?
And it works the other way as well. So in the media, we have, you know, the science says vaccines are good, etc. And then there's another part of the media that ridicule people who are a bit concerned about taking the vaccine. And it kind of works both ways. So people have genuine concerns and are fearful for whatever reason. And we're not very good at addressing those head on. It's more of a like very polarized kind of approach to sorting out a particular issue, I feel.
When it comes to communicating risk, it is quite difficult to get across what the different scales are there as well. Amina, you work with risk and nuclear safety quite a lot. What's your perspective on this, or things you think are difficult to get across?
The storytelling is absolute key in communicating. Small example, the Fukushima accident that happened. Largely everyone thinks that that was a major nuclear accident. It wasn't. It was a hydrogen explosion. There wasn't any radiation release. It was a very different matter, but the way that it was portrayed in the media was so massive that Germany's nuclear energy industry shut down. So the consequences from these kind of things are huge. And again, it's people's perspectives, isn't it? Different industries have different mortality rates. It's not a nice thing to talk about or even think about, but the reality is that all of these industries have mortality rates. The mortality rates for coal is huge. For oil industry is huge. Even solar and wind, even they have mortality rates, right? But they don't catch people's interest such that it becomes such a huge deal. Whereas, like I said, with the Fukushima accident, Germany was like, nope, I'm done. We're not going to do that. And the UK today is still paying for the hit back that we got because people are just like, no, I can't trust this. Ghalia was talking about regulation. We have such stringent regulation in the nuclear industry that in some ways it's excessive, because we talk about radiation shielding and things. As an individual, just going about doing your own thing, you're going to be exposed to background radiation on a daily basis. And if you were pre-COVID world, a frequent flyer, again, you would be exposed to so much background radiation. So it's about the perspective of things. And going back to the mortality rates, nuclear industry has the lowest mortality rate compared to, like I said, coal and oil. And yet the way that the media portrays it is such that if an accident does happen, it gets blown into proportion so much that it has worldwide effects. Whereas if something happens in the coal industry, guess what? The industry doesn't shut down. And these are sort of real things that we need to think about. For example, electric cars, the new thing for, you know, low carbon footprint, but the battery waste, they're explosive. They don't know what to do with that yet. There's not enough research into that just yet. It's not like nuclear waste that we know what to do with it and how to handle it. We need to do better at talking to people. And it's important to have that understanding for the people who are making the policies, but also the public who this will ultimately affect.
So again, it's like, how do you get those nuances across? And I know there are lots of nuclear safety experts around the world that look into these things. It's all based on science.
Yeah, and statistics. It's all data which has all been researched, and like the death rates, 10 to the minus 6 per annum is something that they go off. It's just sort of like a baseline. It's massively low compared to other industries.
I think that like reiterates the need to be very proactive in whatever industries we are that we've all mentioned today, that rather than reacting to issues or scenarios or disasters, we need to proactively be informing people so that they're aware and educated so that they can make like informed decisions. I feel like the public perception of nuclear is always very good in areas where there's nuclear power plants. They see the benefits that it's brought to the local area, whereas in areas where there isn't nuclear power plants, there's not that engagement. So I think being proactive in whatever industry we're in is really important.
Yeah, and I think the regulatory aspects become quite important as well. I mean, Rwayda, I get the impression this comes up a lot in your field of civil engineering. Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the difficult things to talk about that you'd want a non-expert to know about?
Yeah, well, I'll have an example from my background in fire engineering. So in case of fire, you would think the main reason for mortality will be the fire itself. However, it's the smoke, and it's the toxic smoke that people would inhale will cause more death cases than the fire itself. So it's one of the misconceptions people would have in case of fire. It's like they will be burned by the fire. However, it's the smoke that would travel all over the building. We'll have like lots of regulation on controlling like the movement of the smoke within the design. And people would think they're safe if they have the smoke alarm. That one of the things that you would need to always be careful about is getting it checked and maintained. And that would work for almost all the civil engineering applications. So like you'll have this bridge made from steel, but it's not necessarily will be safe for long term. So you'll need to maintain it every now and then and to keep it safe and to eliminate any risk.
Yeah, I get the impression that a lot of thought goes into like making things safe so people can kind of go about their lives freely and don't really have to think about like all the safety implications of like a lot of the things that we do and a lot of the places we visit.
Rwayda, do you think it's hard to communicate that to people? Do you think it's hard for them to kind of understand that, yeah, you've got like a fire alarm, but you also need to kind of maintain it? Is that communication quite hard, do you find?
Yeah, it's difficult like to communicate is like the maintenance bit, because like if it sits there, it's not necessarily is functional, because you would need to check its batteries, and sometimes the batteries would like, no, you start beeping, and you try to ignore it. And some people have a very sensitive smoke alarm, and they'll be rubbing it with something so it won't beep, which is even more dangerous. For like not having it is better than rubbing it with a plastic, because you think you have it, but you don't.
That's interesting, because that's almost the science communication we've not talked about, which is science communication when we're not there. We've made a fire alarm. It's already in people's houses. How do you keep that kind of science communication? Or
that will be with awareness. So you'll need to raise the social awareness of, I think that's touching back to Ghalia's point in the start with tap water being safe to drink.
You think so many adverts you've seen about smart water and mineral water from this place and, you know, from the mountains, it's all so good. I have never seen a tap water advert in my life. And maybe the tap water industry is missing a trick there.
To be fair, I drink water off the mountains when I go camping, but I do usually purify it first because I don't know what's further upstream. Mountain water's not all that good. So we've talked a lot about some of the things that are difficult to communicate. Do any of you have any like really good examples you'd want to share about how the nuances in the storytelling and getting across different risks or addressing someone's fears? Any examples of storytelling that have been really good at addressing one of those things?
I think we talked about big numbers. Amina said the fatality is 10 to the -6. These big numbers that we use as scientists and engineers doesn't make sense to normal person, so we have to put it in perspective. So I think Amina comparing like nuclear fatalities to coal fatalities, you know, because they're a direct comparison, makes good sense. And so that's something that was really hammered in my postgraduate studies was, you know, you do these life cycle assessments, but then how do you relate it back? You know, you can't just do a life cycle. You can't say, oh, well, this emits 10 tons of carbon, because what does 10 tons of carbon mean? So you got to scale back, well, 10 tons of carbon from this particular process is equivalent to that.
How many pineapples is it equivalent to?
How many pineapples?
That's the question.
That's the question we all want to know. Yeah.
How many cups of tea?
Yeah. But in all seriousness, getting that data is really difficult. Another thing is being more transparent with carbon offsetting, for example. I want the receipts. How can you prove that? Again, it comes down to trust.
I think it's almost important that we don't trust what people are saying, that we do question it and that we do dig deeper and we do hold people accountable. If you're saying, oh, I've offset all my carbon for the last year, prove it. Show me the receipts. I want to know how you've done it. And if you've done it properly, make other people do it too.
Do you think there's an argument there, like maybe not so much not trusting people, but just getting people to question stuff a bit more and think a bit more critically?
Critical thinking is the key, I think, yeah.
But also importantly, having the right place to go to. People need to ask intelligent questions. People need to be more engaged, but they need to have a safe place where they can go and ask these questions and get good, solid answers back.
I think it's just like having a simple message across is the way on like communicating science in a more like relevant way.
Following on from what Rwayda and Amina have said, though, I think there's definitely a thing about building trust in relationships. So it is a two-way communication. It's a long-term kind of relationship. You're entering a relationship basically when you're communicating, and it's a two-way process. And you have to be kind of open to listen to other ideas and opinions. So if there's anything we can take away from today, I think communication is basically a relationship. So there you go. There's some free relationship advice today.
We all need it, Ghalia. One thing that I know we've not mentioned yet, but I think is really interesting, is people watch a load of science fiction. They don't struggle to engage with those. One of the reasons I like science and stuff is from movies, especially like space movies and things like that I watched when I was a kid.
The movies have got that whole storytelling arc, and like people want to be entertained, I guess. But I really liked Ghalia's point about building those relationships and getting to know some friendly scientists that'll be willing to sit down and do podcasts like this, or do documentaries like Ellie does, and start these discussions that you can then have a chat about with your friend. It sounds like we're all united in the shared understanding that communicating the nuances of science engineering is really difficult, but it's important that we keep learning from each other and keep having these dialogues and find these meaningful stories to tell. And I think that's why we all do what we do to some extent, to keep on learning. And for me, that's exactly why I got into science, because I really wanted to learn and I was curious about the world. So I think we'll probably leave it there for now, but if you're interested in carrying this conversation on as a listener, we are on Twitter, so please get in touch with us. The Twitter handle is in the episode description, and we'd really be interested in hearing about your questions. What do you want us to answer, and what conversations do you want to hear from us?
The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.